Chapter 4, Military Organization and Command. Section 4A, United States Armed Forces. 4.1, Command Authority. Since the birth of our nation, policies and directives have been made by civilians assigned to the military and to the executive and legislative branches of the government. Command authority is the established levels of responsibility for command, control, and communication throughout a chain of command. Responsibility and authority for the U.S. Armed Forces extends from the U.S. President through the Secretary of Defense, through two distinct branches of command, and through each commander at every level in the branches of service. The various levels within the chain of command have different responsibilities and authority. However, each level in the chain is responsible for all lower levels and accountable to all higher levels. Commander-in-Chief. The U.S. Constitution establishes the basic principle of civilian control of the U.S. Armed Forces. As Commander-in-Chief, the U.S. President has final command authority. However, as head of the executive branch, the President is subject to the checks and balances system of the legislative and judicial branches. Chain of Command. By statute, the chain of command runs from the U.S. President, through the Secretary of Defense, to the combatant commanders. For all the forces not assigned to the combatant commanders, the chain of command runs from the U.S. President, through the Secretary of Defense, to the Secretaries of the military departments. When forces are assigned to the combatant commanders, administrative control over those forces still typically flows through their respective service branch. Note: a provision of the Goldwater-Nichols Department of Defense Reorganization Act of 1986 permits the U.S. President to authorize communications through the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, placing the Chairman in the communications chain of command. 4.2, Department of Defense. With over 1.3 million members in the regular forces, another 826,000 in the National Guard and Reserve Forces, and 742,000 civilian personnel, the Department of Defense is America's largest government agency. The mission of the Department of Defense is to provide military forces to deter war and protect the security of our country. Headquartered at the Pentagon, the Department of Defense includes the Office of the Secretary of Defense, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Joint Staff, and the departments of the Army, Navy, including the Marine Corps, and Air Force. Furthermore, the Department of Defense includes the Unified Combatant Commands and forces dedicated to combined commands, defense agencies, and field activities. As the civilian head of the Department of Defense, the Secretary of Defense reports directly to the U.S. President. Secretary of Defense. The Secretary of Defense, SecDef, is appointed by the U.S. President, with advice and consent of the Senate. The SecDef serves as principal defense policy advisor to the U.S. President and is responsible for the formulation of general defense policy related to all matters of direct and primary concern to the Department of Defense, and for the execution of approved policy. In addition to exercising the operational chain of command between the U.S. President and the combatant commanders, a specific responsibility of the SecDef is to provide written policy guidance for Department of Defense national security objectives and policies, military mission priorities, and projected levels for available resources. The SecDef also provides the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff with written policy guidance regarding contingency plans. The Secretaries of the military departments and the combatant commanders are provided written guidelines to direct the effective detection and monitoring of all potential aerial and maritime threats to the national security of the United States. The Armed Forces Policy Council. The Armed Forces Policy Council assists in matters requiring a long-range view, formulates broad defense policy, and advises the Secretary of Defense on policies, as requested. The Armed Forces Policy Council consists of the Secretary of Defense serving as the Chairman of the Council, the Deputy Secretary of Defense, Secretaries of the Army, Navy, and Air Force, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Under-Secretaries of Defense for Policy and for Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics, the Deputy Under-Secretary of Defense for Acquisition and Technology, and the Service Chiefs. Under-Secretaries of Defense. There are 5 Under-Secretaries of Defense: Policy, Comptroller, personnel and readiness, acquisition, technology and logistics, and intelligence, who assist the Secretary of Defense. The Secretary of Defense receives staff assistance through a number of special agencies, such as the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, Security Service, and Defense Logistics Agency, which provide special skills, expertise, and advice. 4.3. Joint Staff. The Joint Staff assists members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in carrying out assigned responsibilities of strategic direction, unified operation of combatant commands, and integration of all branches of the military into an efficient force. By law, the direction of the Joint Staff rests exclusively with the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The Chairman normally manages the Joint Staff through the Director of the Joint Staff. The Director is selected by the Chairman after consultation with other members of the Joint Chiefs and with the approval of the Secretary of Defense. The Joint Staff consists of more than 1,500 military and civilian personnel, composed of approximately equal numbers of officers from the Army, Navy, and Air Force. Marines make up about 20% of the number allocated to the Navy. Chairman, Joint Chiefs of Staff. Appointed by the U.S. President, by and with advice and consent of the Senate. The Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, CJCS, holds the grade of General or Admiral. The CJCS outranks all other officers of the U.S. Armed Forces, but may not exercise military command over the Joint Chiefs of Staff or the U.S. Armed Forces. The CJCS is the principal military advisor to the U.S. President, the National Security Council, and the Secretary of Defense. The Secretary of Defense may assign CJCS responsibility for overseeing the activities of the combatant commands. The CJCS presides over the Joint Chiefs of Staff and objectively furnishes recommendations and views of the Joint Chiefs to the U.S. President, National Security Council, or the Secretary of Defense. Vice Chairman, Joint Chiefs of Staff. The Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, VCJCS, appointed by the U.S. President, by and with advice and consent of the Senate, is a member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The VCJCS performs duties prescribed by the Chairman, with the approval of the Secretary of Defense. The VCJCS cannot be from the same branch of service as the Chairman, serves a tour of 2 years, and may be reappointed for 2 additional terms. When required, the VCJCS assumes the role of acting Chairman in the Chairman's absence. Senior Enlisted Advisor to the Chairman. Senior Enlisted Advisor to the Chairman, SEAC, is designated as the highest senior enlisted position in the U.S. Armed Forces. The SEAC is appointed to serve as an advisor to the Chairman and the Secretary of Defense on all matters involving total force integration, utilization, health of the force, and joint development for enlisted personnel. The SEAC also serves as a spokesperson to leaders and organizations on applicable issues affecting enlisted forces. Joint Chiefs of Staff. Subject to the authority, direction, and control of the U.S. President and the Secretary of Defense. Members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff serve as advisors to the President, Secretary of Defense, and the National Security Council. The Joint Chiefs provide the strategic direction of the U.S. Armed Forces and review major material and personnel requirements according to strategic and logistic requirements, and establish joint doctrine. Members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff are also responsible for the assignment of logistic responsibilities to the military services, formulation of policies for joint training, and coordination of military education. Members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff are the Chairman, Vice Chairman, Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army, Chief of Naval Operations, Chief of Staff of the Air Force, Commandant of the Marine Corps, and Chief of the National Guard Bureau. For the Service Chiefs, Chief of Staff of the Army, Chief of Naval Operations, Chief of Staff of the Air Force, Commandant of the Marine Corps. Their Joint Chiefs of Staff duties take precedence over all other duties. Consequently, as the military heads of their respective services, the Joint Chiefs delegate many duties to their Vice Chiefs while retaining overall responsibility.